Welcome to the Talk Cocktail Podcast. I'm Jeff Shackman. Long before we talked about social media bubbles or even had smartphones, American media was fragmenting in ways that would fundamentally transform our politics. The rise of cable news, talk radio, and later digital platforms didn't simply change how we consumed information. They altered the very nature of what constituted political knowledge and community in America. The medium did become a part of the message. This transformation didn't happen by accident. It was, my guest David Pakman argues, the product of deliberate choices made by political and media actors who recognized that emotion and tribal identity could trump empirical reality. In his new book, The Echo Machine, Pakman traces how right-wing movements methodically undermined traditional gatekeepers of information while simultaneously eroding the educational foundations that once produced critical consumers of news. The result has been a decades-long degradation in our capacity for shared understanding. This is not, according to Pakman, about nostalgia for a pre-digital age. Instead, having built his own independent media platform from a small Massachusetts radio station to a significant digital presence, he confronts the economic and psychological forces that he believes drive our current condition. His book arrives at a moment when even describing objective reality can seem like a partisan act. A phenomenon Pakman dissects, drawing on both his economics background and years of navigating the evolving media landscape. David Pakman began his broadcasting career at 21, founding what would become the David Pakman Show as a community radio program in Massachusetts in 2005. Originally from Buenos Aires, he holds degrees in economics and communication, and his program has grown to become one of the most successful independent progressive political shows online. It's syndicated internationally and across multiple platforms. It is my pleasure to welcome David Pakman here to talk about The Echo Machine, how right-wing extremism created a post-truth America. David, thanks so much for joining us.
It's my pleasure. Thank you for having me.
Well, it is a delight to have you here. When we talk about extremism on the right, when we talk about this taking truth and twisting it around, we're talking about something that happened long before Donald Trump. Talk about that context, first of all.
Well, in the book, I kind of trace this arc which puts Trump at an opportune moment, but really as the beneficiary of 50 years of a move towards the further and further extreme right by the Republican Party in the US. And although you could start the story at a few different points in time, I choose to start it in the book with the Civil Rights Act and the push towards civil rights in the late 1950s and early 1960s. And I talk through, and we can go through it in whatever level of detail you want, I talk through how that became the catalyst for what ultimately led to Trumpism and Donald Trump being elected in 2016. And it's a path that goes through Ronald Reagan. It's a path that goes through Bill Clinton, and then Republicans taking over the House with Newt Gingrich in charge in 1994, subsequently to George W. Bush, through Obama, and ultimately to Donald Trump.
And in many ways, it's as much of a cultural story as it is a political story, because certainly the case can be made that politics is downstream from culture in much of this.
Without a doubt. And in fact, in the chapter where I sort of go through this story, much of it really does center around what we now consider to be cultural issues. They're really politico-cultural issues. And that includes the reaction to the push for civil rights by those who didn't like the direction that was taking us. It includes the role of religious conservatives in opposing Bill Clinton in 1992 and coalescing around Gingrich in 1994. It's not really very much about what we might consider economic issues today, although of course economics and personal finance play a major role in that. But in fact, I would say you're completely right that it is very much about cultural issues and the way they were presented and discussed by elected officials at the time.
We talk a lot about the truth-free environment that we're in today, and you talk a lot about it in the book. In your view, what was the single inflection point or the various points that really transformed our dialogue, our political dialogue, to where we are now?
It's very difficult to say exactly what the point was. One of the things that I've talked about before I'm going to give you an analogy to the question. Sometimes people kind of ask me, when did it feel like my show was finally successful? And I always say it never did, because, from day to day, things change very little. It's sort of like watching a baby become a toddler. And what's the day where it was no longer a baby and now we had a toddler? And there were so many small inflection points. The role of the political parties was important. Technology and social media and accelerating the speed with which mis and disinformation could be spread played a major role in that. The willingness of elected officials to go above and beyond what I sometimes call politician lies, like, we lowered the deficit, is more of a politician lie, where maybe you can find some narrow area and a specific period of time during which that deficit growth slowed, right? That would be like a politician lie. But to just the out and out alternative fact stuff, drawing on a hurricane map with a Sharpie would be an example of that, something Trump did during his first term. So it's really difficult to find those inflection points.
Certainly, talk radio for 20 years had a large role in all of this.
Talk radio had a huge role. And there is a history of talk radio and the way in which a lot of those early AM radio stations and licenses were scooped up by really the religious right and some national religious organizations. There's a very good book that I think is out of print now called Waves of Rancor, which focuses on that and goes into detail about it. That was a huge factor, because eventually a lot of those religious right-oriented stations became just politically right-wing. The religious component went away, or it was handed over from a church holding the license to another one of these AM radio conglomerates. So I think that that's an important one for sure.
And why, in your view, have progressive politicians and the left in general not been as successful in this regard?
There's not one answer to that. There's a few different things. And I want to, as someone who is on the left myself, I want to try to be as objective as possible in my assessment. I'm not a neutral observer, but I still want to be as objective as possible. One of the explanations is that a lot of these right-wing ideas lend themselves to these platforms. And if we were in an environment where it was the Lincoln Douglas debates, or I'm going to read a book with one perspective and then another book with the other perspective, it would be a different game. But as a couple of examples, the idea that on taxation, listen, it's my money, I should get to keep it. It's so perfectly simple that it lends itself to a 4-minute cable news debate in a way that we on the left don't take the opposite view, right? We don't take the view that taxes should just be as high as possible. You should get to keep as little of the money you earned as. No, we don't take that view. Our view is, well, listen, in an ideal world, you would keep as much of the money you earn as possible. We understand from sociology that when human groups surpass 150 people, you need some level of centralization to organize things, or it becomes completely impossible. We want an appropriate level of taxation for the services that it makes sense to provide. We've kind of already lost, right? Because it just doesn't lend itself to the bullet points and the talking points in the same way. Just one other example. The debate around women's bodily autonomy and medical freedom. Hey, listen, killing is bad. Abortion's killing. We're pro-life. That is far simpler than debates around bodily autonomy, gestational viability in a fetus. So I think that structurally is a major starting point of advantage for the right.
To what extent is the lack of critical thinking that we see today playing a role in this? And to what extent has social media, in a very real way, contributed to that?
They're both inextricably linked factors. And shortly before the 2024 election, I was in Las Vegas. And I was interviewed on a podcast by a guy who I won't even name him because it doesn't even matter and I don't want to attack him, but he nominally supported Trump, but he admitted he wasn't a highly political person. And the topic of tariffs came up, and it became clear that this gentleman believed that China pays the tariffs that are placed on its goods by someone like a Donald Trump. And when I explained to him, no, it's the importer that pays the tariff. If you want to buy these Chinese products, you pay the Chinese company for the products, and you as the American company then cut a check to the US government for the tariffs. That's a factual reality that he didn't know. And it was the moment got over 25 million views because on one hand, the kind of sheer innocence and honesty with which this guy had no idea that that's the way it works was interesting. But also, how many people who supported the Trump tariff policy had no idea that it's the American companies that pay the tariffs and thus it's passed along to them and they end up paying more? That's a critical thinking deficit fueled by rather, the millions of social media posts praising Trump for being the strong alpha, for having the willingness and audacity to impose these tariffs. And at a base level, these folks don't even know how the tariffs work. So I think it's a major issue. Tariffs are a tool that can make sense or not, depending on the situation, depending on the environment. But if we don't even have an understanding of how the tariff works at a core level, it's extremely difficult to engage in any substantive debate.
It brings it back around to what you were talking about a few minutes ago about the simplicity of the argument on the right. An argument that because it's simple is easier to put in a 20-second TikTok video or to put in social media. To the extent that something requires more careful analysis, it makes it much more difficult in today's media environment to get that message out there.
Yeah, without a doubt. And I think the other aspect to this that is important, so we talked a little bit about, I think the arguments lend themselves a little bit more to the sort of right-wing framing. We're talking about social media and the speed at which this stuff can spread. I think we also shouldn't ignore that at least in the independent space I occupy, the right is far better funded than the left. The right has Turning Point USA, it has the Daily Wire, it has a lot of these podcasts, programs, shows, and institutions that are gathering people, exciting them, and building momentum in a way that we just do not have on the left. Now, I still think our communication needs to improve and so on and so forth, but that's also another difference. And then fourthly, I also point to the algorithmic biases that have developed in social media. Other than TikTok, which is roughly 50-50 in terms of ideological split on the political spectrum, all of these platforms are dominated by the right. Now, there are those who will say they're dominated by the right because the right-wing ideas are more popular, and we could explore that. But at least as far as it comes to Twitter, now known as X, it's an overtly right-wing algorithm that is funneling people into those echo chambers. Meta, which includes Instagram and Facebook, and their decision prior to the 2024 election cycle to say, we're just not really going to promote political content anymore, which of course benefits the right because non-political shows about business, real estate, working out, or whatever have been coded with right-wing messages. That hurts the left much more than it hurts the right. So I do think the imbalance algorithmically on these platforms would be kind of like the fourth element to this.
But given that there is plenty of money on the left, and we know that, we've seen over and over again the money that goes into Democratic campaigns, why is it that the Democrats and the left have not been as good at this? Why is there no equivalent of Turning Point on the left?
That'd be a question for the people who have the money to do it but choose not to. If I had to guess, it's a few things. I don't think the left is as good at the long game of this, and I'll give you an example. In 2020, when Joe Biden won, yes, they spent months with frivolous lawsuits and conspiracy theories about, for election fraud. But they didn't go away for 4 years. In fact, they doubled down on Turning Point. They doubled down on getting their message out in less overtly political spaces, in-person conferences, Freedom Fest, all of this stuff. When we saw Trump win in November of 2024, my program experienced, it was only a few days, but it was an immediate kind of checking out. We're demoralized and we're kind of giving up. My program recovered very quickly, but as we're recording this interview, MSNBC is completely restructuring its schedule because their ratings are not doing well. CNN's having a major ratings problem, and a lot of it is sort of linked to despondency and this kind of surrender that some on the left seem to be navigating towards. I think that that's the wrong response. I think that it would make much more sense for our reaction to be what the right wing reaction was in 2020, which is we need the next 2 and 4 years to completely reorganize, restructure, and rearm. Why it's not happening, I don't know. The answers probably lie in psychology, and to some degree, we'd really have to ask the folks who have the money to fund such things.
There really is a situation, and this is part of what the right got correct about all of this, that it's possible to organize and do all of these things and grow these organizations without it necessarily being a direct attack on the other side, that you grow the organizations and you put the mechanisms in place for when they're needed.
Without a doubt. And it's much better to have these tools and these networks and not to need to deploy them in a sort of urgent way than not to have them and be panicking to build them. And I'll give you another kind of anecdote, which maybe is a sign that things are starting to turn around. One of the criticisms I made of the Democratic Party after the 2024 election, a lot was made of Kamala Harris didn't do Joe Rogan's podcast. And I never thought that the Joe Rogan podcast was going to be dispositive in deciding who won. But the bigger issue was the Democratic Party has not sort of built an ecosystem and an environment where the referendum on, it's the new version of who would you rather have a beer with, is in the left's favor. When Kamala Harris did the Alex Cooper show, they built a studio for that interview and had Alex Cooper travel to do the interview. And the entire thing felt not particularly genuine, very tense. You knew there were people standing off camera counting the minutes of the interview, and it just doesn't really work very well. And when I was invited to the White House and met with senior administration officials and former President Biden in the weeks after the 2024 election, I said to them, it doesn't work to start reaching out to us in October of an election year. And it doesn't work to tell us we get 12 minutes and we have to talk about these 2 topics, directions which, by the way, I regularly ignore. You need to really start building this ecosystem earlier. What worked really well for Trump, it wasn't, Trump did Rogan and Kamala Harris didn't. It was Trump did Lex Friedman, and he was on with the Nelk boys, and J.D. Vance was on with Theo Vaughn, and they did this for months, and it was less structured. They were hanging out. It would be 1, 2, 3 hours. You will never replicate that if a candidate's staffers reach out to me October 15th. And fortunately, just in what we've seen so far of 2025, I've interviewed, I think it's at least 4 sitting US senators, all of whom reached out to me. We are now talking about going to DC to cover State of the Union and other things. So I'm sort of cautiously optimistic, I guess is my point, that some of this ecosystem is now starting to be built.
One of the other things that enters this equation is the media landscape today. It is constantly changing, and the importance of understanding what those changes are and not being nostalgic for the way it used to be.
Well, yeah, I think, so here's my view in general on, I think I could apply this to technology, but also more broadly. I have, in studying the history of when major changes to the way we communicate in politics is done and all of these things, when I've looked at how it has kind of evolved, there is typically a reaction of, we have to stop this, which almost never works. And we would be much better off, sort of the way that Neil Postman wrote in Technopoly. We would be better off thinking, how can we exacerbate the pros of whatever change is happening and regulate or limit the cons? And so my approach is, I want to recognize the ways in which these changes are not serving the average person, independent media, the landscape overall. But also, I don't know that I would call it a sense of futility, but history kind of tells me, looking back, the idea that we would have blocked cars because the horse buggy drivers were going to lose their jobs, it seems so implausible as to be laughable. I really want to focus on let's be better at taking advantage of the changes rather than trying to just move back to before these changes came forward, if that makes sense.
But in order to take advantage of the changes, one has to understand them, that the organizers, that the politicians need to understand what those changes are in
Yes.
order to do exactly what you're saying.
There's no doubt about that. And it does seem as though the political left and the Democratic Party have been slower to come to understand that than maybe the political right has been. And you could argue that part of the reason was after Barack Obama won in 2008 and was reelected so easily in 2012, they had more of a fire burning under them to do so. I think this is an argument one could make. And so they were in a position where they maybe felt like their backs were more against the wall. And even when Democrats lost in 2016 to Trump, it felt so anomalous and like a one-off that maybe even that didn't really light the fire, although we did see significant turnout for the marches in early 2017. So maybe to a degree it was circumstantial.
And do you see any evidence that that kind of organization might happen now?
Yeah, I mean, like I said, I am cautiously optimistic about listen, just this month, as I mentioned, I've interviewed 4 senators. They've all expressed interest in coming back. I've been invited to do in-person interviews at the Capitol for the State of the Union with senators and members of Congress, something that never happened before. I'm participating in a briefing with just a handful of other of the bigger independent media people, off the record briefings with a couple of governors who I won't name just because I don't even know if I'm supposed to. This is a difference. A question is, does this help win elections? I don't know the answer. I think, it's too early to say. We've still got a while until the next midterm, but I'm cautiously optimistic that there's a change happening.
Well, the other thing that has to go along with that is a consistent message out there. And you talk about that in your book.
Yeah, I think that the consistency is a big factor. I also believe that there's a degree to which, one of the other, not to just spend all the time criticizing the Democratic Party, but one of the things that I think would be better for the Democratic Party would be rather than having the idea of what a candidate should look like and then trying to mold or shape or change someone into meeting that description or fitting that mold, the Democratic Party might be better served just to find the people that, as they are going to be more appealing in the modern political era, given the influence and impact of social media and rapid communication technology. And to a degree, I don't think that Kamala Harris's the start of Kamala Harris's campaign I thought was quite good, and then it morphed into something different where the speeches became repetitive and it seemed much less free flowing. They got away from the "these guys are weird" stuff, which I thought was working relatively well, and it didn't really fit the way that the real Kamala Harris presented, as far as I could tell. And so I think that finding the right candidates also has to play a role here.
Part of it is also the issue of ideological purity that sometimes gets too wrapped up in all of this.
Yes, without a doubt. And I've been very vocal about that. There's a degree to which, while the election is going on, the right will welcome anybody. We disagree about this issue, we disagree about that issue. Doesn't matter. If you have doubts about the Democratic candidate and you are joining us, you are welcome. Now, of course, as we're seeing right now, after the election, when it's time to govern, it's not quite as kumbaya big tent, but it doesn't matter because the question is, how can you use it to win elections? One of the things that was concerning from the political left was the degree to which the purity tests were used to exclude. And we saw this to a degree with regard to those who said, hey, you know what? I am concerned about crime, and I don't know that I'm hearing what I want to hear from Kamala Harris. This involved the Gaza situation, to some degree, issues around trans sports, a lesser degree, I would say. And it started to become a little bit too much. You're either with us on everything or you're against us, or we're abandoning your candidate sort of thing. And I think you're absolutely right in pointing that out, that that's not a good way to win elections.
And what do you think happens now in the short run? What happens over the next 6 to 12 months?
Well, I think part of it depends on the degree to which, I mean, right now, as we're recording this interview, Trump, Musk, Doge is essentially in control of the federal government. Emails just asking employees to justify what they're doing or potentially facing layoff or being fired. We are seeing, Elon Musk attending a cabinet meeting, giving press conferences in the Oval Office, the very unelected bureaucrat that Trump said he would get rid of. There is one view that this is going to persist for the next 4 years. I think if that's the case, I do expect there to be mass protests in opposition. On the other hand, there's those who believe that with two egos so big as Trump and Musk's, this is bound to explode. And if that happens, then it becomes a question of whose perspective and whose voice becomes powerful in guiding Trump. And then there's also, quite frankly, this kind of question mark around Donald Trump's health, only insofar as a number of folks on the left and the right have expressed that they think a Trump health event will be the key issue of the defining political issue of 2025. It's, of course, very speculative. Statistically, it's certainly plausible, obese 78-year-old who doesn't exercise and eats fast food all the time. But of course, there's a lot of unknowns right now. 6 months from now, will Elon Musk be involved in government or not? What will Trump's health look like? What will Ukraine-Russia look like, which seems to be kind of a defining aspect of foreign policy for this administration? I don't know the answer to those questions.
The other part of it is also incompetence and the damage that brings along with it and the dangers that it brings with it in situations that we can't even imagine at this point.
Without a doubt. And I hate to channel Donald Rumsfeld, but it's the unknown unknowns that with an administration that is this much of a tinderbox, really. The unknown unknowns are really the issue. I had a viewer write in the other day and said, David, do you think Trump would be open to either staging or allowing a terrorist attack if he felt that he would benefit from it politically? And this is very touchy stuff, and I think it's important to be really careful. I don't think Trump has any moral sort of framework that would make him say, I would never do that. Stage versus allow are two different things. I don't think he could pull it off, but I think if putting aside the issue of staging or allowing, how would a President Trump with a Secretary of Defense, Pete Hegseth, and Elon Musk in and out trying to get contracts for Starlink and whatever else, how would they deal with such an attack, either on US soil or with an ally or elsewhere? I couldn't begin to tell you.
And again, to quote Donald Rumsfeld, of all people, is that sometimes the solution to an intractable problem is a bigger problem. And to the extent that something horrible happens, it may be a way to get at Trump in ways that seem impossible now.
That's totally plausible. And to a degree, the Trump tax, what was the one real legislative accomplishment of Trump's first term? I would argue it was the 2017 tax cuts, and they were impactful. But then COVID comes along and completely blows out of the water economically with regard to stock market, unemployment, job creation, supply chain, inflation, everything that 2017 tax plan did. It's not because that tax plan was good or bad. I think it was probably the wrong direction, especially if you have a populist perspective. But the impact of COVID was so overwhelming that had Trump handled it correctly, he would have easily been reelected. He didn't. But to your point, it was a bigger problem that completely overshadowed the smaller one.
David Pakman, his book is The Echo Machine, How Right-Wing Extremism Created a Post-Truth America. David, I thank you so much for spending time with us.
Thank you for having me. It's been a pleasure.
Thank you.